Hello and welcome to this video where I'll be talking about how representation is the death of lore and world building. I'll here use the idea of world building and lore as interchangeable as in many aspects it is. So first of all, what is representation? Representation in the context of media is trying to depict people, cultures, ideas and issues in literature, film and television, usually in a flattering light, especially when it comes to groups of people categorized as underprivileged. As here it says the most important aspects are both the visibility and accuracy, would say adaptable, and fairness of the portrayals, which usually results in some sort of form of flattery. What is world building then? World building is the process of creating an imaginary world with the goal of making a setting for a story that is believable and coherent. It helps ground the story and create a point of reference for it. From that we see already where the incompatibility comes in. World building wants you to craft a history, culture, languages, politics and religions. Representations, on the other hand, wants you to showcase aspects of society, people, cultures, ideas, etc., which are from our real world. Here, there's already the first incompatibility. Because if you want to create something new, then you can't accurately portray something from real life. There is cases where something is considered positive representation while being completely inaccurate to real life. That, for example, is Wakanda. But in that case, that just results in extreme flattery. And here we see how those perspectives conflict. Those who are pro-representation, so for example transgenders here in this case, believe lore is bad, lore is the killer of art, lore is for the wiki, for the database, for the narrative. Lore strangles narrative, there is no good lore, anything good attributed to lore is storytelling reaching for its smog. Whereas those who are pro-world building and less for representation say lore is the foundation that everything in a setting is built upon. Without it, all you have is empty aesthetics. What the Victor von Steiner does not acknowledge here is that that's exactly what the transgender wants. It wants empty aesthetics upon which it can write in representation, so itself, to directly insert itself without needing to change or adapt anything for the setting. Those two individuals seem to not understand that they want two completely different things that conflict with one another. They seem to think that there is some sort of miscommunication here with them having the same goal but thinking on a different execution. No, the very goal between the two is different. One wants to essentially have an aesthetic or a system they can directly insert themselves into, an extension of the real world plus, or the real world fixed or improved. The other wants a completely separate world, self-governing, with its own coherent rules to immerse themselves in. Those goals are not compatible. Here we can see examples of world building versus representation. Usually you can simply tell it by vibes, but I would say a characteristic of representation is to attempt so-called normalization. You try to showcase something that isn't normal as normal. The way that is done is by ignoring the implications of it. For example, in world building we see Toph, she is blind. That offers her disadvantages such as not being able to see anything while on Appa, or if she doesn't have any ground underneath it. Her being able to still fight and be powerful is explained via the magic system of the setting, which is earthbending, where she can sense things via vibrations and via the earth. This would be an example of world building. In the case of representation, we see here a guy somehow climbing a rope with one hand in a wheelchair up a cliff while holding a crossbow in the other. The reason for this piece is clearly not to showcase a unique limitation here, because logically this is impossible, simply because he's holding a crossbow in the other hand. The goal here is to show the individual in a wheelchair as equally capable as a person without a wheelchair, while having the wheelchair aesthetically there. But it also is generally another aspect of representation is to directly insert things from real life. The wheelchair is exactly the kind of design you see in a modern wheelchair if you go outside. An extra rim for holding stuff, two wheels, a backrest, and straps to attach yourself in. There is nothing in this piece that tries to immerse you in the world. It only tries to transplant from our world and then add fantasy aspects on top, which is here the green skin and horns. Another example is, again, a blind swordsman. They are very common in fiction. Here, Fujitora uses gravity alteration to somehow sense his surroundings. On the other hand, here we see again a wheelchair. This is a sports wheelchair just completely inserted from real life. Obviously, this scene makes no sense because what does he? He's surrounded by two individuals, but he has one knife and he needs to use the other to move. Because he can use only one wheel, he can only spin in a circle. This is obviously a nonsensical combat situation. But again, we see here the goal of self-insertion to directly transplant an idea from real life, and the idea of normalization, meaning that while the aesthetic is retained, the individual is treated as equally competent as a normal person or healthy person. Lastly, to get away from blind swordsmen and wheelchairs, I'd say a good example of a wheelchair-bound or not able to walk character would be Ivar the Boneless from the TV series Vikings. He can't walk, but he is a complete sociopath. He basically makes up for his lack of strength in legs with his charisma, with his status as the son of Ragnar, and with his ruthlessness as well as his strong hands. In this scene, we see him intimidating a group of soldiers. He, in reality, has no strength to actually fight them, but through his reputation, which has basically become mythical at that point, they are scared to engage him, which is a good way of handling that in my opinion. He also doesn't use a modern wheelchair. He tries to use crude metal contraptions to walk around, he tries to use chariots, or he simply is seen sitting while his other people walk around him. So it's a case of world building. Now back to representation. Wolfenstein probably was made with a guy with a pregnancy fetish, but ignoring that, we see again cases of normalization where we see a 9-month pregnant woman killing people with a machine gun, and her then also going out on combat missions. To any normal person this is obviously completely nonsensical, but as the goal here is to represent pregnant women, the representation has to be positive, because they are, I guess, some sort of marginalized groups. As such, they have to be shown badass and capable, even if it makes no logical sense. The situation also tries to attempt normalization. As such, it's never really mentioned that she's pregnant. The things she does are just things she does. It's never mentioned that, oh, she has to engage in a combat role because, I don't know, she needs to go there because she's the only one who knows a code. Or she's needed because the people are so understaffed. No, he just goes there. It's not elaborated, it's just treated as a normal thing, and as the goal is normalization, but because it's treated so weirdly, it stands out even more. Now getting out of disabilities and into the world of Avatar again. For some reason in the Avatar comics in Korra, there's a Muslim. Again, it's just an attempt at representation and normalization. She's wearing just a normal real-life hijab. She's also black, an ethnic group which doesn't exist in the Avatar universe. She just is there. It's not explained. Islam doesn't exist in that world, yet she is wearing a hijab of Southeast Asian make. It even clearly is a hijab because it has the underscarf and the second scarf on top. And again, it's just an attempt at normalization. It's transplanting something from the real world into a setting, having someone represent it. In the original series, on the other hand, we had swamp benders. Someone could say that they're a representation for native Amazonian tribes. They do possess some traits of native Amazonian tribes, but because they are in the Earth Kingdom, you can notice that they don't have the color that an Amazonian tribes person would have. No, instead they have the Chinese Asian look, which the Earth Kingdom is known for. They also use Earth Kingdom colors in their clothing, which is green, meaning that despite them obviously taking some inspiration from real-life Amazonian tribes, they are their own distinct group which is grounded in the setting they're in. They are also not portrayed as wholly good or wholly praiseworthy. They're in fact portrayed as like Floridians, Louisianians, hillbillies. They have good traits where they're kind people, for example, but they're also shown eating weird food and being kinda nasty and hygienic. This is world building. They have traits which are unique to them. They have various sources of inspirations for how they talk, for their demeanor, and they are grounded in the world they're in. The random as fucking Muslim woman is not. Like, she's just there. You can't even tell what nation she's supposed from. Like, what is that yellow? What nation in the Avatar universe uses yellow? The only one I can think of is air nomads. So, while talking about normalization, the way normalization starts. So, as seen here, a big goal of representation is normalization. So, showcasing as things which don't belong somewhere as belonging there, or things that are abnormal as being normal, by simply not mentioning it. Baldur's Gate 3 does this a lot. It tries very hard to combine both world building and representation, but in my opinion, it just comes out weird. Because, for example, the setting has obvious racism with tieflings calling you Magresham, with Gif calling you Kifrak. So there is discrimination there. It tries to portray this more historical form of that, with the druids being bigoted towards the tieflings. But then you have, for example, the relationship between Dame Aelin and Kefrik's wife or daughter, whatever she was called, and it's never mentioned. It's never even acknowledged that they're homosexual. And this mismatch gets even weirder when you realize that the races, like, you have tieflings, humans, etc. But for some reason, some tieflings look just extremely black from facial features, or some tieflings or some drow look Asian, and it's again just never acknowledged. It's treated as normal. While the entire cultural and aesthetic around them is portrayed as very European looking. And there exists racism between the races, but there doesn't exist racism within the races, and there doesn't exist sexism in any sort. And you could say, okay, this is their choice, this is how they made the world building. But this is not world building. This is representation, because they in no way acknowledge it, on purpose. If they, for example, try to build into the homosexuality into their world building, then it should be explained via some sort of pantheons. It should be at least mentioned, there should be characters for it and against it. Whereas in representation, the goal is normalization, so everybody universally accepts it, and it's never brought up as something that stands out. And while this, you could say it kind of works with sexuality, because you can just decide that's how the setting is, such freedoms are often taken. Even in the 80s, it was just decided, yeah, women are as strong as men for the purposes of this game. Sure. But as you keep just pushing this, it starts becoming weird. Like, for example, the previous case shown with disability. People in wheelchairs portrayed as equally capable as normal people without any additional explanation, and the idea that an explanation is needed being treated as bigoted in its own way. Well, the most, I'd say, known conflict between world building versus representation is Warhammer with female space marines. One which I'd say is also worth mentioning and maybe easier to explain would be the Genshin Impact boycott related to Natlan. Natlan is basically a fire-themed region within the Genshin Impact world. It's its own complete region. We see that the characters from the region generally are pretty light-skinned, they're just normal people, some like from all other regions. But the whole thing caused a boycott to try to change it. The Western quote-unquote fans decided that because the region is partly based on South America, that all the characters need to be brown. Hell, some decided that even though it's based on South America, some of the characters are Polynesian for some reason. That's because they don't engage with Natlan as Natlan. It's not a place that exists. Same with its own rules within its own universe. In the same way that people who are pro-Space Marine don't engage with Warhammer as its own setting, with Space Marines and Warhammer having its own special set of rules which need to be obeyed, and it being the world book. No, they see it as a vehicle to transplant real-life ideas in. As such, when Natlan was added, it was decided that it's the South America region, mainly because of the fans, ignoring all the other influence there, which is Africa, the Caribbean, Polynesians. No, it became ignored that it's a combination of things, established in the setting and real-world influences, and instead, demand started to come in for it to be just a representation of what's happening in real life, or of real-life concepts. And freedom of world building, or things that made it fit with the other regions of the world, are not acknowledged. Instead, they're seen as mistakes, or as malicious, or as whitewashing, or cultural appropriation. But how can you appropriate Natlan culture? It's made up. It exists in the confines of its own world. And the idea of representation does not acknowledge that because it's opposed to what they want, which is the representation of certain groups from real life. Basically, representation does not treat settings as self-contained things. It treats them as extensions of real life or additions to them. So it's real life plus, at best of cases. And that's why I think that world building and lore and representation can't coexist. At best, in the best cases, like let's say Baldur's 3, it's a tug of war where the world building is so good you can ignore some of the attempts at blatant representation. But representation always takes away from world building. It's just always in conflict with that. In Dungeons and Dragons, it caused races to stop having their own unique flavor. And it also caused some races to be boiled down to be just IRL proxies, like in the recent source book, orcs being just Mexicans, and it being removed that they are warlike or rapey. It just destroys the settings, because complexity, if something is based on various sources from real life, it's boiled down to a single thing, because it's supposed to be representative, which we see the incompatible goal. One wants to create a setting that is self-contained and unique, the other wants to transplant things from real life, expand upon them, or change injustices from the real world. The starting point is also different. Again, one wants to create a new thing, the other wants to create a framework to insert real life thing. The motivation is also different. The motivations of world building is to create a coherent world which makes logical sense. The logic of representation is to insert things from real life, retaining the aesthetic of what is there in real life, and to normalize concepts which are considered non-normal. This causes also tonal mismatch. In world building, you have a logical flow. You have good guys and bad guys, you have the bad side and good side switching sides. There always is a winner and a loser. In works which are based on representation, let's say Black Panther, you either need to represent a group accurately or in an overly flattering manner. This means that if you want to create a world with representation, there can always be only one side that is the good guys and one side that is evil. And the side that is evil is always the groups which are considered undeserving of representations. In this case, white people, for example, or white men. You see that, for example, in the recent game that came out, Dustborn. There's an evil fascist empire, and then there is a group of degenerates. That's because it's a setting which is built in mind with representation. So all the groups which are minorities are represented in the most flattering possible way, but you still need bad guys. So the bad guys have to be the groups which don't need to be represented, or which don't deserve representation, so white people. And in the end, it's just an incompatible frame of reference. Because the whole desires and what they want to achieve with their settings and with what they're creating and what they want is different for world builders and those who want representation or self-inserters. Self-inserters want to basically everything be an isekai. But the kind of isekai where everything is just modern day America. That's why when they create fantasy settings like here the Radiant Citadel, you see a modern market with every single race under the earth, with glowing signs. It's basically modern day America with a different aesthetic. They want to basically have the version of the real world, but better or more optimal or kinder. Because they treat settings as extensions of real life. They treat them within the context of what's happening in real life. That's why they can have very contradictory statements, like for example a nation ruled by trans people, which is still considered oppressed. That's because they don't consider it within the context of the setting, they consider it within the context of real life. They oppress real life, and as such they carry over the status in the setting even if they are like super powerful or godlike in there. Whereas world building tries to create something detached from real life with its own logic, making it, and I think I made the case for it, that world building and representation, or law and self-insertion, are incompatible concepts. And if one wants to world build well, one needs to just swear off completely representation. Swear it off, ignore it, even contradict it if you have to, on purpose.